It's Malcolm Out Loud. Welcome to the show here. It is my pleasure to have with me Rabbi Ben Kamin. And, you know, I spoke with Rabbi Kamin on our radio show just recently out of Utah. How you doing, Rabbi?
Well, I'm just doing great and glad to be back with you and have a second opportunity to talk about these issues, really.
Yeah. I very much appreciate it. I thoroughly enjoyed meeting you just recently on the radio show, and thrilled to have you on our TV program. So
delighted. Thank you.
So let's take it here, and now let me bring folks up to speed a little bit that Rabbi Kamin is a respected scholar on the civil rights leader, and he's also the author of 3 books on Martin Luther King Jr., and I understand a 4th one to come, which we'll talk about just ahead in this segment. Rabbi Kamin was born in Israel in 1953. He holds the degree of Doctor of Divinity from Hebrew Union College. He has a rather unique perspective on the man behind the legend, if you will, his humor, his fear, the fact that he never wanted to be a civil rights leader. And we're speaking of Martin Luther King Jr. There's a lot of unknowns about Martin Luther King Jr., and I think there's a lot of misnomers that I sense today, Rabbi. There's a lot of things people don't really understand about this man, what he stood for. He's iconic today. Would you agree with that?
Yes, and I think there is a lot of mystery about him, but it's not a question of mystery that evolves from a sense of foreboding. It's a sense of mystery that is really based in curiosity and the need people have to fill up this legend with his humanity, the things that he felt and feared, as you suggest. Yeah. He was a real man, a human being.
Yeah, right. And now you've been following his career. What's the? I mean, you've really studied Martin Luther King Jr. Tell me, where was the connection for you, and why did you take this on? Because you're in the process of releasing a 4th book next year. Is that correct?
Yes, it's a new book, and it's called Dangerous Friendship, and it's about Dr. King and the FBI, and that whole difficult aspect of his rather short life.
Yeah. How old was he when he died? How old was he when he died?
He was 39. In fact, just 39 years old, and everyone on that balcony, just outside room 306 at the Lorraine Motel, which is now the National Civil Rights Museum, everybody was under 40 years old. All of his closest associates, and the civil rights movement, for all practical purposes, came to an end with his death. It never really succeeded at the level or at the poetry that he brought to it after that. But they were all young guys, and he himself repeatedly predicted that he would never see the age of 40. He knew this was coming. If not that night, he knew it was coming.
Yeah, that's what I understand, is he knew that he would die early somehow or another, and there's many talkings of, I see that in many places, so I don't think that's a secret. But you just said something that I find profound in this whole thing, this conversation, when you say the civil rights movement really died upon his death. Let's talk about that a moment, please. Because, Rabbi Kamin, I find today there's a lot of nuances, I think, when the conversation of race comes up in America and the name of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. comes up, and, again, the black community. There's a lot of things I want to talk to you about today with the current administration, where we stand today. But, all right, so take a guess for me here now. If Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was not assassinated at 39 years old, and let's say he had lived another, 20, 30 years maybe,
yes.
What would the I mean, you really don't know, but what do you think the result would have been?
Well, I don't think that he, ironically, and perhaps it's a very bittersweet thing to say, I don't think that his effectiveness as a civil rights leader would have continued. He probably would have, and probably happily retired into academia and really rediscovered his roots as what he actually was. This was a young man who was first and foremost a preacher of the gospel of Jesus Christ. That is all he really wanted to do. He set out to establish his own kind of world and success away from Atlanta, away from the shadow of his rather large in stature and in presence dad, Martin Luther King Sr., the so-called Daddy King. He went to Montgomery, Alabama in 1955. He was only 26 years old because he wanted to be his own man. Ironically, that's exactly the same time when the black folks in Montgomery began to organize the famous Montgomery bus boycott, and they turned to him for leadership of it. And we can talk about why if you choose as we speak today. But I think that one of the things misconstrued about him, that even though he had a terrific sense of humor, he was a wonderful mimic, he had a searing fear of mortality. He was almost assassinated by a deranged black woman in 1956 when he was stabbed right near the heart while signing his first book in a bookstore in Harlem. He lived with repeated death threats. His house was bombed several times. He didn't flee from the limelight because he felt a moral responsibility, but it's not what he wanted to do, and he knew he'd pay for it with his life, which contributed to a great deal of depression, a great deal of sexual philandering, and a complicated personal life, which never, however, compromised the purity of his message and his humility, which was paired with the guilt he felt over the fact that so many people were put in danger because of what he chose to accept as his destiny. So his effectiveness was peaking, and in fact was beginning to recede, ironically, at the time of his death. And other more radical, louder voices, people who were going to become more media savvy, I don't think he would be very much in the foreground had he lived on today, and I think that would have pleased him, frankly.
I see. Rabbi, you've taken a strong stand against the names of, the Jesse Jacksons, the Al Sharptons, and I want to touch on this just a moment. And listen, I'm not trying to be funny here, ugly, or anything else. Right. I've also addressed some of the concerns I've had with these gentlemen because, being a news and political commentator myself, I see them as opportunists. Now, this is my opinion, not necessarily yours. I haven't asked you yet, but I see them as a possible opportunist and with really, again, sort of taken the black community as hostage, if you will, almost. And I think it's been a detriment against the civil rights movement. Am I totally off base, or am I anywhere where your beliefs are?
Well, you're not totally off base at all. But I just want to preface my response in general to that there are also a lot of white folks who have co-opted the civil rights story. And I mean, what was Glenn Beck doing a couple of years ago? Seizing the mantle literally at the Lincoln Memorial and trying to replicate Dr. King's "I Have a Dream" speech. I mean, that actually was funny. So it's not confined. It's not a racial issue. And I know you agree with that general perspective.
I do, and I thank you for saying that. I really do, because I absolutely agree with it. However, the reason I point out. The reason I point out Jackson and Sharpton, of course, because they represent the black community in such a way, you understand, and they're known as, really two of our strongest black leaders today.
I would say that they claim to represent the black community. I don't know if they really do, and they don't represent the best interests of the black community, that's for sure. Al Sharpton is an unconvicted felon. He is a media opportunist. I have heard many of my wonderful colleagues in the African-American community and others as well complain to me bitterly because I do have this kind of aura. I'm sort of the white guy who's in with this thing and the rabbi and so forth. And I do it because I care about it passionately. To me, this is a reflection of what we just read in the Passover Seder about the Hebrews leaving Egypt for the first Freedom March. Black Americans are America's Hebrews. Having said that, a lot of black folks don't appreciate the fact or even resent the fact that Al Sharpton doesn't often show up to places to supposedly inspire and help and heal unless he gets a nice paycheck. You don't have to be black, white, green, whatever to not appreciate that. Jesse Jackson, I think I have my concerns with. I've met him several times. He certainly has a tremendous presence about him. I do credit him for laying the groundwork for the first election of a non-white president. I'm in no way discussing politics here. I'm talking history because of his they have to be regarded as symbolic runs for the Democratic nomination. twice in the 80s, because what did happen is that a lot of African Americans did register to vote. And that in itself was a tremendous positive step. And that helped to build a foundation upon which Barack Obama was elected, and incidentally, as the first African American president.
He was, and I respect what you just say, but I want to now, I want to turn the table a little bit, and again, let me talk next and be respectful, and if you feel I've crossed the line with you, you let me know, please, okay?
No problem.
I'll give you, I'll qualify that in advance to you, but...
I'll turn the TV off.
Exactly. But let me just ask you here a moment.
Sure, go.
Again, I've had some very dynamic black conservative leaders on our show. We've talked about, listen, I don't profess to be an expert in this particular area, and I certainly am not going to profess to be one with you. However, I understand common sense, and I speak about these issues every day on national radio around the country. In our own show here, Rabbi Kamin. So what I want to touch on is that most people that I see out there don't really realize that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was really a Republican, and most blacks at that point of time in history were also, many of them were Republicans, and there's a lot to this. When I say that, some of the folks that I think in the black conservative movement today, which is growing but not enough, really believe that the black community has been hijacked. Now, I use that word because it's been said to me in such a tone, playing back to what you just said about Obama, but they believe the Democratic Party has hijacked the black community. And listen, this gets very political, I understand, but within the whole entitlement conversation and other things, and really keeping these wonderful people oppressed. And is there any truth to this in your belief, or is this just totally make-up stuff?
Oh no, it's not at all totally made up stuff. I mean, there is a general trend that you're addressing, which I think is correct. I do want to state, just for the record, that Martin Luther King Jr. was neither Republican nor Democrat. He eschewed that kind of identification, and he'd be the first one to celebrate the fact that any number of black Americans, whether 3% or 80%, choose today, 2 generations later, after the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Acts and the great victories of the very brief 13-year Civil Rights Movement, to do whatever they want to do. He would not want black Americans to be labeled as Democrat or Republican. That was the whole point. He did have a relationship with President Kennedy, which was not as successful or even as warm as many people assume. As we look back, and history gets a little blurred. Kennedy, a Democrat, obviously,
right,
was not enthusiastic about the Civil Rights Act, which he ultimately did present to Congress just before his own death, because he was finally so moved by the plight of young black Americans in places like Birmingham and Selma and all over the South.
Well, actually, he let me jump in here. From what I understand, President John Kennedy voted against the 1957 Civil Rights Act while he was a senator, as did against Senator Al Gore Sr. And after he became
that's all correct.
Okay,
yeah, so right. King was not enamored of these guys, but not because they were Democrats or Republicans. It's because they just didn't really care that much. It was Harry Belafonte, as a matter of fact, who met with John Kennedy, the candidate, and made King actually aware that there was much more hope for the black legislative agenda with Kennedy than with a possible President Nixon at that time. Now, on the other hand, in all fairness to the Republicans, President Eisenhower, a great Republican, and I think an extraordinary president, and of course a remarkable general who changed history, and through Normandy broke the back of the Axis. President Eisenhower was very committed to desegregation. He acted forcefully and proactively in the Little Rock, Arkansas school crisis in the mid-50s. So I think that we all are in a way co-opting history, and I include myself and I include you, again, with the same respect, by just putting labels on these things. These guys, these rhapsodic preacher leaders from the African American community were just looking for somewhere to alight. And when they went to the local city councils and they went to the state governments, they didn't go to people because they were Democrats or Republicans. They went to them because they thought there might be good men and women. Now, historically, there is this association of the Republican Party with African Americans, most immediately because Martin Luther King Sr., Daddy King, King's father, was a Republican. But he, unlike so many others, were Republicans because they projected the fact that Abe Lincoln was a Republican. But the word Republican meant something entirely different then than it does now.
That's right.
And it's just like you don't say, well, I dismiss the entire Bible and the entire Scripture because there's so many things in it that are outdated or bizarre or even untoward in terms of human behavior.
Well, possibly a better way to say it that I probably should have worded that is that, as you referenced Martin Luther King Jr., that, he didn't consider himself a Republican, Democrat, et cetera, and I understand that. Let me say this. I have a much bigger appreciation, knowing what I've discovered in recent times and recent interviews, and even talking with you recently on radio and now this show. I have a much bigger appreciation for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and understanding more of the roots of the man, historically where he comes from, and also talking to people like Reverend C.L. Bryant, runaway slavery, Deneen Borelli, many others who represent black conservatism. And I think there's something to this, but I think right now that worries me when I say it's the Republican Party who embraced King. And they embraced a lot of black Americans at that time. The problem they're having today, as we talk now in 2013, Rabbi, is that the Republican Party today doesn't know how to embrace the black community. You understand?
Well, that I'm going to agree with, and I don't know what they're doing trying to dismantle the Voting Rights Act, not because they're Republican Democrats, because it was one of the great achievements of American history to bring back into the franchise of the ballot a segment of the population not only as large as the black minority, but a segment of the population whose ancestors were slaves.
Right.
I mean, property. I mean, so why we're nitpicking about it now, and that
I can answer that question for you. How's that? We're nitpicking.
Okay.
Wait, let me answer one for you.
I love an answer because I think it's very troubling.
Well, sure. Well, let me give it to you. We're nitpicking about that now because we're in a very political, polarizing agenda. Everybody has their self-agenda. It's all hooray for me and the hell with you in the limelight of America today. And our political leaders and our politicians at whole, Rabbi Kamin, have what I call short vision or no vision. They're worried only about their short agenda for today. They have no care or need for the country as a whole after they're out of office or serve their purpose or whatever it is. There's a complete change in our fabric of society today and our political landscape across America, and that's exactly why we're having that problem today.
That's a fine answer. I agree with you, and that's why a lot of great people, men and women, black, white, Native American, Latino, are not even running for office because they like to think. And they actually have genuine concerns about the issues, and they can't get anything done. So they're turning to other social service agencies, community outreach, and so forth. And that's why we're all walking around for 20 years now going, where are the leaders?
Right.
Well, they don't want to run.
That's exactly it. It's what
they have no privacy.
I say that all the time. Media, Rabbi Kamin, our conversations could be linked right there because they're exactly that. All right, let me remind folks right now a moment here. I'm speaking with Rabbi Ben Kamin again, and let me give you the website as well. It's www.benkamin.com. You'll see it on the screen periodically throughout the show here. Ben Kamin, Kamin.com, if you will. You'll find out a lot more about Rabbi Kamin there. I enjoyed his site and looking at it. And I want to talk next about your book, and I want to talk about specifically Room 306, the significance of that. And I also want to talk about, Rabbi Kamin, where we sit today in history right now as we now come on the 45th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I want to come back in a moment and just tell folks, I want to talk to you about, the legacy of Dr. King.
Yes.
What can we expect ahead? What's the vision ahead? But before we do that, let's come first so folks understand. Room 306 is a book that you have written, your recent book, and you've written several books on Dr. Martin Luther King. Tell me about 306, please.
Well, this is a book it's an oral history of remarkable turn of events that did occur in Memphis and had national implications following the assassination of Dr. King on April 4th, 1968, just 45 years ago. The Lorraine Motel very quickly was actually a wonderful, very well-kept lodge, a Holiday Inn-style lodge that received visitors who were among the greatest musicians, ball players, preachers, artisans of this country, but they were all black because they came to Memphis to play baseball or to preach or to perform. And if people like Aretha Franklin, Sammy Davis Jr., and it goes on and on and on, and Ray Charles, to perform, on Beale Street or in some of the great hotels of Memphis, like the Peabody Hotel, where they were not permitted to lodge because they were black, where they had to enter the facility where they were going to entertain white folks, and really were revered for their talents, which were extraordinary, but they had to enter through the back door or through the kitchen entrance because they couldn't walk through the lobby. So the Lorraine Motel on the edge of downtown was a place operated by Walter and Lorraine Bailey, who were very audacious and who bought the former Windsor Hotel, which many years before had been frankly a white-only whorehouse. What an irony! But made it into a great place. And among its most prominent visitors, whenever he came to Memphis, which was often because a lot of civil rights business was taking place in Memphis, was Reverend King, and he loved it there. And he was a bit of a celebrity, but also very accessible.
So the name is now it's the National Civil Rights Museum, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
It took 20 years or so from the assassination of Dr. King and the near foreclosure or physical destruction of the Lorraine Motel, and the teamwork of a lot of people of both races in Memphis, many of whom didn't really like each other very much, to nonetheless come together and transcend the old bigotries and establish not only the museum itself, which is beautiful and meaningful and a real national landmark. It still has the balcony at room 306, but this led the way in the restoration of Memphis, or its transition into a truly modern city of the New South. FedEx came in, all kinds of corporations.
Well, it sounds like a place I need to visit for sure and get out there. So between Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Elvis Presley, I guess Memphis is pretty well covered, huh?
Well, no, yeah. Memphis has the St. Jude Children's Center, hospital center, I should say. It is a very successful mid to large size city that did not really suffer much of the civil rights violence or the civil violence, I should say, that other nations did in this country, because ironically of the assassination which took place there, which forced Memphians to really take a look at their city. Right. They were not going to become another Dallas.
Okay, Rabbi Kamin, let's take our last few minutes and let's talk about, for a moment for me, if you will here, the legacy of Dr. King right now, where we stand right now. And, we've covered some ground here. We've talked about, the black community as a whole, the civil rights movement in the 60s, the political aspect of this. So let's talk about right now, in the last few minutes we have, Dr. King. What's the greatest legacy as we now come to our 45th anniversary of his assassination do you think that this country needs to pay attention to?
Well, I think the single most important aspect of his legacy is that, and this is a reality, this is not just, fantasy or imagery. Martin Luther King, a reluctant prophet, as it were, nonetheless succeeded before his death at 39 years of age to literally transfer scriptural ethics into the active legislation of this country, and no one else has ever done that. And the physical enduring monument to that is literally the fact that we now have in Washington, juxtaposed to the memorials to three great parental parents of this presidents of this country, we have a monument to MLK. This is the first such monument in Washington to both a non-president and a citizen, not to mention an African American. So it's an extraordinary thing. A lot of his life, the truth of his life, the facts of his life have been blurred by our need to glorify people to beyond what they really were. He was a hardworking, often very frightened, given to depression man with extraordinary oratory skills, but he was relentless. He was selfless. He didn't make any money. I mean, whatever funds he earned or were raised by his Southern Christian Leadership Conference, he donated all of it to that conference and to the civil rights movement. Much to the chagrin of his wife, I might tell you, he lived very modestly, unlike the Al Sharptons of the world today, who are making money off of civil rights.
Right. All right.
But the fact is, this is a guy who single-handedly, and many people had to help him, but he converted Scripture into American ethics, and that has never been done before, and I don't think will be done again at that level, because we don't have that level of thinking. But I do want to say that at the end of the day, King himself saw himself as a preacher of the Christian gospel, but he felt that gospel was needed to transfer America from the promise President Lincoln tried to make after the Civil War, which was not only unrealized for decades, but shrouded in the horror of Jim Crow laws and segregation, which became part of state laws. Well, he didn't have any idea himself of what he accomplished.
Well, Rabbi, you obviously believe, as I do right now, that obviously Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was and is an American hero, clearly.
Oh, without question, and perhaps the greatest single American who wasn't a president, certainly.
And imagine what he accomplished in 39 years. If we could all be so lucky and blessed to accomplish, 10% of that, maybe, I don't know, in our lifetimes, that would be truly amazing. All right. So, in last moment or so, again, as we now come through the 45th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., we take a look around our country right at this moment, and we see what's happening with racism, and we see the civil rights issues we still are having today in a very profound way. And there's a lot more conversation of this that you and I will have ahead, I'm certain of it. But what's the best lesson for America right now that we need to take forward if we're going to fix this thing, brother?
Well, I think the difference between then, before Dr. King accomplished what he did, and now is we have to remember this. As long as there will be human beings, there will be racism. But there is a difference. We now identify it. We're offended by it. And a lot of families, a lot of American families don't subscribe to it. Their homes are open. We have blended families. We have intermarriage and so forth. And I think that we at least have a conscience. It's not a given, and it is not part of any state law. Racism, the separation of people by the color of their skin, was actually part of the state mandates of many states in this country. The federal government was inspired by King, working with President Lyndon Johnson after President Kennedy's death, to make it illegal at least. Now, we can make it illegal. The real legacy will be realized when it's no longer immoral. Right. Or I should say, when it becomes moral to do this kind of stuff and to include everybody, and not just because it's a legal requirement. Thank you.
Rabbi, you are I'll tell you, you're one of the wisest voices, and I mean this very, very, very deeply, one of the wisest voices I've ever seen or heard in regards to this subject matter, and it sounds to me like you need to be heard more and more. You have a good grasp of the issues here, and I think this is one that we need to take on in our country. Rabbi Ben Kamin, the website, again, is www.benkamin.com, Kamin. Latest book is Room 306, a fascinating look at Dr. Martin Luther King and his assassination, and the National Civil Rights Museum now in Memphis, Tennessee.
That's right.
You'll find another series of books, Nothing Like Sunshine, a story in the aftermath of the Martin Luther King assassination, A Dangerous Friendship, Martin Luther King Jr., the Kennedy brothers, and Stanley Levison. Quite a few books on that. Dr. Kamin, thank you for joining me.
My pleasure.
Thank you. It's so good to have you, and we'll talk again, I'm sure, on this. Blessing to have you here.
Take care of yourself.
Thank you.
Be well.
Thank you. Folks,
Bye.
Thank you for joining me on the show here. Remember, it's Malcolm Out Loud here. Get involved, get loud.